Welcome to the Plateau of Plato, your sanctuary for sleep. Tonight we will not calculate anything. We will not seek exact answers. We will simply listen to the very first rhythm that a human being ever heard. His name was Pythagoras. He lived in the 6th century BC on the island of Samos, but he sought wisdom in Egypt and Babylon to return home and teach those who were ready to hear the music where others hear only silence. And he knew a secret that we have forgotten. The secret of the Tetractys, the forgotten code of the universe. 10 points arranged in a perfect triangle, to some, merely a drawing in the sand. To the initiates, the blueprint of reality itself, a map according to which the stars, the elements, and the human soul were created. Within this figure lies the secret of silence. Not that empty silence that comes when voices fall still, but that deep, full silence in which all forms of this world ripen. The silence where the stone still holds within it a future face, and the star is only just learning to sound. In the workshop of the gem engraver Mathematici, silence always carried weight, and little Pythagoras learned to distinguish its shades before he even began to speak. Within this cramped space, filled with the scent of heated wax and wood oil, time stood still. Outside, beyond the thick stone walls, the island of Samos was noisy and restless. There, mule drivers shouted, port workers argued over prices for Syrian grain, and the wind brought the salt spray of the Aegean Sea. But here, inside, the law of absolute concentration reigned. The father of Pythagoras, Pythagoras, sat at a low workbench. His back was bent, and his fingers, accustomed to the finest work, carefully held a shard of dark red carnelian. Pythagoras sat nearby on a small bench, with his legs tucked under him. He tried to breathe in time with the movements of his father's hand. In the hands of Pythagoras was a copper chisel, the tip of which was lubricated with a mixture of oil and diamond dust. Every strike on the stone was a barely perceptible touch. It was not the crash of a builder or the knock of a carpenter. It was a whisper, a barely audible chirp, like the song of a cicada on a hot afternoon. The boy watched the golden dust that slowly settled on his father's calloused palms. For him, these dust particles were star fragments that Pythagoras extracted from the depths of the earth. On the tiny surface of the stone, no larger than a fingernail, a pattern began to emerge. At first, these were vague shadows, but gradually, out of the chaos, the outlines of a lion, the curve of a grapevine, or the profile of a god were born. Pythagoras saw a miracle. He saw how hard, soulless matter obeys an invisible will. In the evenings, when the light of the oil lamp became dim and flickering, Pythagoras would begin to speak. His voice was low and hoarse, like old parchment. He told stories of his travels to distant lands. He described the huge temples of Egypt, where columns looked like frozen palm trees, and the markets of Babylon, where people calculate the movement of planets on clay tablets. Little Pythagoras listened, and pictures of other worlds rose before his eyes. He understood that his native Samos was only a tiny point in a huge ocean of meanings. His father would take a finished gem in his hands and hold it up to the fire. The stone flashed from within, as if a particle of the sun had been locked inside it. Pythagoras said that the master does not create an image, he only releases it from the captivity of the stone. He taught his son that inside every object lies a hidden idea, an ideal form that must be seen with the inner eye. These words fell into the soul of the child like seeds into fertile soil. He did not yet know that he would spend his life trying to find the same ideal form for the entire universe. Pythagoras ran his finger over the smooth surface of the polished agate. The stone was cool and surprisingly dense. There was reliability in this sensation. The world ceased to seem to him a collection of random things. He began to see connections. Just as the pressure of the chisel depends on the hardness of the mineral, so everything in this world must obey a certain hidden rhythm. He fell asleep on his mat, inhaling the scent of olive oil, and in his dreams, geometric figures danced to music that he had already begun to foresee. The island of Samos in those distant years was experiencing its golden age under the rule of the tyrant Polycrates. It was an era of bold ambitions and incredible engineering feats, a time when it seemed that the human mind could subdue any force of nature. The air of the island was saturated not only with the scent of pine resin and blooming oleanders, but also with the spirit of constant search and creation. The dust from the ceaseless construction of the great temple of Hera settled on the boy's sandals, reminding him that greatness is measured not only by the height of columns, but by the precision of every prior calculation. Pythagoras often came to the foot of Mount Castro, where hundreds of slaves and Freemasons dug into the solid flesh of the mountain. There, they were building the famous tunnel of Eupalinos, a grand aqueduct designed to bring fresh water to the heart of the city. The boy would spend hours watching the masters use their simple tools, plumb lines, and measuring ropes. He was struck by the fact that the work was carried out simultaneously from both sides of the mountain, and yet the men were absolutely certain they would meet exactly in the center. In this certainty, he saw not arrogance, but a deep knowledge of the hidden laws of space. He understood then that geometry was not merely an exercise in the sand, but a force capable of piercing through solid rock. The road led him further, to the sacred Heraion. The enormous temple of the goddess Hera was rising ever higher, becoming the most massive structure the Greek world had ever seen. Pythagoras walked among the scaffolding, craning his neck toward the sky, where the tops of the columns vanished into the rays of the midday sun. He touched the cool limestone with his palm and felt a rhythm. The columns stood at a strictly defined distance from one another. Their diameter followed a single rule, and the overall proportions of the building evoked a strange feeling of peace and rightness. Here, mathematics became visible and sacred. It transformed a heap of stones into the harmonious dwelling place of the gods. In the evenings his path led him to the bustling port of Pythagorean. These were the main gates of the island, through which knowledge flowed in from all corners of the inhabited world. Massive ships with dark hulls brought Lebanese cedar, purple fabrics from Phoenicia, and spices from distant eastern satrapies. Pythagoras would sit on the warm stones of the pier and listen to the sailors talk. They spoke of monsters and storms, but more often of the stars, which served as their only reliable guides on the open sea. He saw how navigators used angle measuring instruments and calculations to find their way home across the black abyss of water. All of Samos seemed to him one giant, living laboratory. Blacksmiths in their workshops calculated the proper composition of bronze, weavers created intricate patterns based on the repetition of the same geometric motifs. Pythagoras absorbed this spirit of innovation through every pore of his skin. He saw that the old world of myths and capricious gods was slowly retreating before the power of logic and measurement. Nature was no longer a collection of random wonders for him. It was an encrypted message, one that could be read if only the right key could be found. The sun would slowly sink below the horizon, painting the waters of the Aegean a deep crimson. Pythagoras would return home, tasting the salt wind on his lips and the dust of great constructions. He understood that mere contemplation was no longer enough for him. His mind demanded tools that would allow him not only to marvel at the world, but to understand its hidden architecture. He would fall asleep to the sound of the surf, and in his imagination, the lines of the tunnels and the columns of the temples would intertwine into a single infinite web, enveloping the entire visible cosmos. The old Thales sat on the bank of the Meander River, drawing circles in the sand with his staff. For young Pythagoras, this sight seemed like a doorway into another dimension. Here in Miletus, the wealthiest and most daring city of Ionia, the air was saturated not only with the scent of Phoenician resin and dried fish, but with the fragrance of absolute freedom of thought. The city hummed with life. Its merchant ships sailed the expanses from Egypt to the distant northern lands, and in its squares, men for the first time in human history dared to argue about the origin of the world without fear of the gods. Pythagoras stood a little apart, afraid to break the elder's silence. Thales was already over 80. His face, etched with wrinkles like the bark of an ancient olive tree, held an expression of profound concentration. He was known as the man who had predicted a solar eclipse, and who first asked the question of what all things are made. When the old man finally raised his eyes, Pythagoras saw in them not cold wisdom, but a warm, almost childlike curiosity. Thales gestured for the young man to sit beside him on the warm river sand. Instead of long speeches, Thales invited Pythagoras to watch the flowing water. He spoke of how, beneath the surface of all visible things, a single principle always hides. For Thales, this principle was water. But for Pythagoras, the method of searching became more important. The old man taught him not to take ancient myths on faith. He showed the youth how, with a simple stick and the measurement of a shadow, one could calculate the height of a great pyramid. This was the miracle of similar triangles. In that moment, Pythagoras understood that geometry grants a man power over space, allowing him to measure what his hand cannot reach. Their lessons unfolded during long walks beneath the silver-gray shade of olive trees. Thales spoke of the stars and of how their movements obey strict laws, not the whims of the gods. He instilled in his student the conviction that nature is logical and coherent. Each word from his teacher washed away the last traces of superstition from Pythagoras' mind, replacing chaos with the vision of an ordered whole. The young man drank in this knowledge, sensing that a path was opening before him, one that no one had yet walked to its end. One evening, as the sun painted the waters of the meander a deep copper, Thales said that his own time was drawing to a close. He placed his weathered hand on Pythagoras' shoulder and gave him his final counsel. The old man urged his student not to stop at what he had learned, but to travel to Egypt. There, he said, among the ancient priests, lay the keys to the deepest secrets of mathematics and the structure of the cosmos. It was like the passing of a sacred torch. The wisdom of Miletus was to merge with the ancient knowledge of the East. Their parting was quiet and brief. Soon, Pythagoras stood on the deck of a Phoenician vessel, slowly pulling away from the port of Miletus. He watched the shores of Ionia recede, tasting the salt wind on his lips and feeling the weight of his mission. In his leather bag lay clean papyrus scrolls, and in his mind, the first outlines of a great teaching were already taking shape. He understood that the path to truth would be long and dangerous, but now he carried a compass, a gift from the first philosopher of the world. The ship set its course southward, toward the shores of mysterious Egypt. When the last outlines of Miletus dissolved into the evening haze, Pythagoras understood that there could be no turning back until his mind found its foundation in the eternal laws of existence. The deck of the Phoenician merchant vessel, fragrant with cedar resin and dried fish, became his temporary sanctuary on the path into the unknown. Beneath his feet pulsed the steady tremor of the heavy hull as oars pierced the salt dark flesh of the Aegean Sea in unison. The creak of leather oarlocks and the low rhythmic chant of the rowers created a monotonous, almost hypnotic rhythm that helped Pythagoras sink deeper into his thoughts. He stood at the very edge of the stern, watching the water trail foam and swirl in the ship's wake. He recalled every word his teacher Thales had spoken, and tried to grasp the true scale of the task he had set for himself. The world around him was vast. He felt it now with every fiber, filled with secrets that no single life could ever fully uncover. But this was the very essence of his hunger. He longed to find that root, that single origin from which all the visible diversity of nature grows. The sea itself seemed to him an ideal symbol of this search. It was ever-changing, and yet eternal all at once. At night, when the rowers rested, and the ship sailed under nothing but a single sail, Pythagoras would tilt his head back and gaze into the starry dome above. The Phoenician navigators, stern and laconic men, stirred in him a deep and sincere admiration. He watched as the captain held strange bronze instruments to his eye and charted their course by the unwavering North Star. In those moments, Pythagoras understood that mathematics was not merely an abstract game played with lines in the sand. This was knowledge that saved lives. The precision of a calculation could mean the difference between safe passage and death upon the sharp, unseen rocks of a foreign shore. Number was the invisible bridge that guided the ship through the black abyss of water toward its distant goal. The sailors often gathered on deck to share their meals of stale, sun-scorched flatbreads and exchange stories in low voices. They whispered of Egypt, calling it a land of living gods and sleeping giants. They spoke of priests who possessed the power to stop time, who could read a man's thoughts by watching how a flame moved and flickered. Pythagoras listened to these tales with hungry attention, sifting the seeds of truth from the chaff of superstition. He sensed that it was there, among the ancient stones of the Nile, that he would meet those who guarded knowledge accumulated thousands of years before his own birth. The hunger for origins burned within him more fiercely than the midday sun. Sometimes the sea grew so calm, it became a mirror, and the water began to phosphoresce with a soft, mysterious green light. In those rare hours, a profound silence would settle over everything, broken only by the occasional splash of a flying fish arcing through the air. Pythagoras would hold himself perfectly still within that silence, straining to catch a glimpse of the great rhythm of the universe, the one he had only just begun to sense. He understood now that a human being is merely a single small note in the vast symphony of the cosmos. His journey to Egypt was not simply a voyage across the sea. It was a movement deeper into himself, toward those origins where silence itself is born. At the end of the 10th day of their voyage, the air suddenly changed. It grew heavy, humid, thick with the scent of distant shores. The salt tang of the sea mingled with the aroma of river silt and burning incense. Far on the horizon, where the sky melted into the water, the first faint lights of the Egyptian coast flickered like a promise. Pythagoras gripped the wooden railing more tightly, feeling his heart quicken within his chest. Before him, the gates of a world where time flows differently were slowly opening. He was ready to give everything he had, to become a part of that great mystery that awaited him just beyond the line of the surf. Myths are born where words come to an end, and the legend of the golden thigh became the first sign that Pythagoras carried within himself not only knowledge, but also a higher spark. His arrival at the Egyptian port of Naucratis was met with guarded curiosity. This city was a unique place, where Greek enterprise and bustling trade collided with the imperturbable and monumental eternity of Egypt. Pythagoras stepped onto the shore, not as a timid supplicant, but as a man aware of his destiny. His bearing inspired involuntary reverence. Tall, athletically built, with an open and clear gaze, he seemed the very embodiment of that order which he sought in the structure of the cosmos. Soon, strange rumors began to creep through the market rows and shaded porticos. It was told that when Pythagoras prepared for a ritual washing before entering a local sanctuary, chance witnesses were dazzled by an unusual sight. On his thigh, beneath the skin, a radiance distinctly appeared, resembling the gleam of purest gold. For the people of that time, such signs were no accident. In this they saw the seal of the gods, a direct indication that before them stood not a mere mortal, but the Hyperborean Apollo, having taken human form. This glow of the flesh became a material symbol of his spiritual exclusivity. The legend of the golden thigh grew and acquired new details, outpacing Pythagoras himself on his journey inland. It was said that he was a son of the god of light, come to reconcile the chaos of human passions with the harmony of the celestial spheres. Pythagoras himself maintained a deep and majestic silence on the matter. He understood that for the crowd, a miracle matters more than logic, but for him, this sign was merely a reminder that matter is capable of being transformed under the influence of spirit. He demonstrated his uniqueness not through words, but through his very nature. It was said that even wild birds would freeze in the sky when he spoke, and fierce beasts would tame their temper beneath his calm and commanding gaze. This was the time when Pythagoras began to grasp the division between a mortal shell and the eternal mind. The golden mark on his body served for others as proof of his divinity, but for the philosopher himself, it was a symbol of the higher mathematics of existence. If gold was considered the most perfect and incorruptible of metals, then the mind too must strive for such purity and immutability. His authority grew hour by hour, opening doors that usually remained tightly closed to foreigners. His path led further south, to the great temple complexes of Memphis and Thebes. Pythagoras walked along the banks of the Nile, and in his gait there was the confidence of a man guided by an invisible hand of fate. He saw how ordinary Egyptians bowed their heads at the sight of his white garments and whispered prayers, hoping to touch the hem of his cloak. But his gaze was fixed forward, to where the peaks of the pyramids shimmered in the haze of the hot air. He knew that the divine spark within him was not a gift for self-admiration, but a tool that would help him strike the fire of truth from the cold stone of ancient knowledge. Approaching the massive pylons of the first great temple on his way, Pythagoras felt his inner strength resonating with the ancient energy of this land. He was no longer merely a youth from Samos or a student of Thales. He was becoming a conduit of eternal light. The lamps of the priests could illuminate only the dark corridors of the sanctuaries, but he carried within himself a light capable of illuminating the very essence of the universe. Ahead of him lay trials that would confirm whether the man with the golden mark on his thigh was worthy to possess the golden key to the secrets of the cosmos. Before the entrance to the sanctuary of Heliopolis, Pythagoras understood that Egyptian knowledge was not contained in scrolls, but in the stone itself, speaking the language of eternity. His path to the wisdom of the priests was not strewn with flowers. On the contrary, the Egyptian hierarchy met the foreigner with a cold test of endurance. He was sent from one temple to another, from Heliopolis to Memphis and then to Thebes, as if to check whether the fire of his curiosity would be extinguished under the weight of administrative indifference. But Pythagoras accepted these rules of the game with unwavering calm. To become one with the keepers of secrets, he completely abandoned the habits of a Hellen. He shaved his head, clothed himself in strict linen garments, and embraced the severe asceticism of the Egyptian caste, proving that his spirit was independent of external trappings. In the silence of the temple libraries, filled with the scent of ancient papyrus and dry stone, he began to study the language of symbols. Pythagoras quickly realized that hieroglyphs were merely the outer shell. The true knowledge of the Egyptians was encoded in the very proportions of their buildings. Every column, every doorway, and inclination of a wall was an embodiment of mathematical thought. He spent entire days measuring the ratios of sides in halls and the heights of obelisks. For him, the architecture of the Nile became frozen music, where harmony was expressed through precise numbers. He saw that the Egyptians did not simply build temples, they erected earthly projections of a celestial order. One of his most important discoveries came from observing the Harpatonapti, the legendary rope stretchers. After each flood of the Nile, when the great river washed away all earthly boundaries, these men restored order. Using a simple rope divided by knots into 12 equal parts, they created perfect right triangles. Pythagoras watched, spellbound, as the magical ratio of 3, 4, and 5 transformed the chaos of washed-away land into an orderly grid of fields. In his practical action, he saw the eternal law that would later bear his name. Number once again proved to be the tool for rescuing order from chaos. Gradually, the ice of distrust melted. Seeing his progress in geometry and his supernatural capacity for concentration, the priests began to admit him to the secret rituals hidden from the eyes of the uninitiated. In the half-darkness of the sanctuaries, lit only by narrow rays of sun from high slits in the ceiling, Pythagoras grasped the connection between the movement of the planets and the cycles of earthly life. He understood that the Egyptians did not separate science and religion. For them, calculating the trajectory of Sirius was as much an act of worship as prayer. The world appeared before him as a single mechanism, where every part was fitted to every other with divine precision. By the end of his stay in Thebes, Pythagoras had ceased to be merely a curious Greek to the local sages. He had become an initiate. His mind, tempered by Greek logic and enriched by Egyptian contemplation, now saw through the structure of reality. He learned to hear how the temple stones sang, tuned to a specific tonality. This was a time of deep inner transformation. He no longer sought answers outside himself. He learned to find them within that mathematical framework upon which the entire world rested. When night fell, and the southern constellations rose above the temples of Luxor, Pythagoras would often climb onto the flat roofs of the sanctuaries. He gazed at the black ribbon of the Nile and at the endless sands beyond it. He understood that Egypt had given him a foundation, but his own mission lay beyond the horizon. The knowledge he had acquired demanded synthesis. He was no longer merely collecting facts. He was creating a system in which the geometry of the Egyptians and the logic of the Ionians were to merge into a single symphony of number. His journey into the depths of the Egyptian mystery was drawing to a close, opening the way to new, even more severe trials in the lands of Babylon. When the Persian swords flashed in the sands of Egypt, Pythagoras exchanged the white robes of a priest for the heavy chains of a captive, not knowing that this slavery would become his greatest liberation. The army of King Cambyses swept into the Nile Valley, crushing ancient dynasties and turning sanctuaries into ruins. For Pythagoras, who had only just begun to fathom the depths of Egyptian wisdom, this sudden collapse of his familiar world became a harsh lesson in impermanence. Together with thousands of other captives, he was sent eastward, into the very heart of the Persian Empire. The long journey through scorching deserts and lifeless salt flats exhausted the body, but could not break his spirit. Pythagoras maintained a surprising dignity even in chains, his calm demeanor and quiet words of encouragement instilling hope in the hearts of those who walked beside him in that endless procession of slaves. Babylon met him with colossal walls and the overwhelming grandeur of the Ishtar Gate, shimmering with lapis lazuli and gold. This was a city of a different energy, not the frozen eternity of Egypt, but a pulsing power and mathematical complexity. Confronted with Babylonian culture, Pythagoras quickly understood that his captivity was merely a new form of learning. His extraordinary knowledge and noble bearing did not go unnoticed by the Persian overseers. Soon, word of the wise Greek reached the Chaldean Magi and the priests of the god Marduk. Pythagoras ceased to be a nameless slave and became an honored guest in their observatories atop giant ziggurats, where the sky seemed so close that one could almost reach out and touch the stars. In Babylon, he encountered a completely different system of thought. The Chaldeans did not merely measure the earth, they measured time. Pythagoras immersed himself in the study of the sexagesimal number system, which transformed the sky into a vast, flawlessly functioning mechanism. Here he learned how to calculate the cycles of the planets and predict their movements decades into the future. If the Egyptians gave him the geometry of forms, the Babylonians bestowed upon him the algebra of time. He saw that numbers govern not only the area of fields, but also the fates of entire empires, inscribed in the positions of the heavenly bodies. Babylonian mathematics was dynamic and alive, connecting the movement of the smallest particle of dust to the rotation of the great constellations. The 12 years he spent in Mesopotamia became for him a time of great synthesis. In the twilight, gazing from the height of a tower upon the lights of the immense city, Pythagoras realized that Egyptian geometry and Babylonian astronomy were two hands of the same body of truth. He began to unite the logic of numbers with the harmony of the spheres. It was here that the idea finally took shape in his mind. The entire cosmos is a musical instrument, its strings tuned according to mathematical laws. His mind became a crucible in which the knowledge of three great civilizations, Greece, Egypt, and Babylon, were fused into something entirely new, something that had never existed before. His liberation was as majestic as his captivity had been. The Persian authorities, deeply impressed by the wisdom of the Hellen, allowed him to return to his homeland. Pythagoras left Babylon not as an old man worn down by years of exile, but as a master who had attained the fullness of knowledge. In his memory, he carried thousands of tablets and diagrams, and in his soul reigned an order that no external storm could shake. He was ready to carry this light forward, understanding that his true work was only just beginning. When he once again saw the blue ribbon of the Aegean Sea, Pythagoras felt the circle of his wanderings closing. He was returning to Samos, carrying within himself the wisdom of the ages. He knew the secrets of the pyramids and the laws of the starry orbits. Now his task was to find a way to transmit this knowledge to those who were ready to listen. He walked along the deck of the ship, and the clinking of his former chains still echoed in his memory. But now that sound merged with the solemn music of the cosmos, which he had at last learned to hear in all its fullness. The dust of the roads of 3 empires had settled upon the cloak of Pythagoras by the time he once again touched the stones of his native harbor, understanding that he carried with him knowledge capable of shattering any walls. The island of Samos had changed beyond recognition during the decades of his absence. Under the rule of the tyrant Polycrates, it had transformed into a dazzling facade of the Greek world, where the external luxury of temples and the fleet only underscored the inner unfreedom of its inhabitants. The city hummed with the clang of weapons and the shouts of overseers, and the air was thick with tension and fear before the whims of supreme power. Pythagoras walked through the familiar streets like a ghost from a forgotten past, catching the bewildered glances of his countrymen, who saw in him only a strange pilgrim in foreign garments. His first step led him to the old workshop of his father Menesarchus. There, among abandoned workbenches and stone fragments covered in a thick layer of dust, he spent several hours in complete solitude. The sense of heated wax and oil still lived in the cracks of the wooden frames, returning him to those days when the world had seemed simple and comprehensible. Pythagoras understood that the old world of his childhood was gone forever, and no force could restore that innocence of perception. Now his workshop was to become the entire inhabited world, and his stones human souls. He touched the cold anvil, and felt that his mission on Samos would be far more complex than merely teaching geometry. Soon, word of the sage's return reached Polycrates himself. The tyrant, who loved to surround himself with brilliant minds for the sake of his own prestige, invited Pythagoras to the palace. The meeting was fraught with unspoken opposition. Polycrates wished to use the philosopher's profound knowledge to strengthen his own power, offering him honors and gold in exchange for the secrets of Babylonian astronomy and Egyptian mechanics. But Pythagoras sought different disciples. He saw that the spirit of his homeland was poisoned by intrigue and the lust for gain. He answered the tyrant with a polite but firm refusal, understanding that true wisdom could not serve as an instrument of oppression. To avoid excessive attention and noise, Pythagoras moved his teachings to a deep cave on the slope of Mount Kirkis. In this natural sanctuary, far from the city markets and the tyrant's spies, he began to gather around himself the first followers. In the silence and half-darkness of the cavern, lit only by the faint flame of oil lamps, his voice carried particular weight. He taught them to hear the music of the spheres, where others heard only chaos. These were the first steps toward the creation of a brotherhood, in which men united not by right of birth or wealth, but by the purity of their minds and their readiness for knowledge. Yet Pythagoras quickly realized that Samos had grown too small and stifling for his designs. The political atmosphere was heating up, and the followers of Polycrates began to see in the secret school a potential threat to the established order. A conflict of interest was becoming inevitable. One evening, gazing at the stars from the summit of the mountain, Pythagoras finally understood that his path led westward. He needed new soil, free from dictatorship and old grievances, where the seeds of his teaching could sprout into a mighty tree of a new society. The island of Samos had been his cradle, but it could not become his home. Preparations for the final departure were conducted in the strictest secrecy. Pythagoras gathered his few belongings, aware that he was leaving his homeland forever. His destination was Magna Graecia, the southern shores of Italy, where cities still preserved a spirit of freshness and inquiry. He understood that his task now lay not only in the dissemination of knowledge, but in the creation of an entirely new way of life, founded upon justice and numerical harmony. A ship awaited him in a secluded bay, and when Pythagoras stepped onto its deck, he felt no sadness. He knew that he carried with him the only treasure that could never be taken away, the knowledge of how to transform the chaos of human existence into a perfect cosmos. When Samos dissolved into the salt haze, Pythagoras understood that his true homeland was no longer a scrap of land in the Aegean Sea, but that perfect order which he carried within his heart. The ship, slowly making its way westward, seemed a tiny splinter in the vast palms of Poseidon, but for the philosopher, it was an ark, bearing the seeds of a new civilization. Pythagoras sat at the stern, his gaze fixed on the place where the horizon erased the boundary between sky and water. Behind him remained the intrigues of Polycrates, the stifling arguments of the market squares, and the bitterness that his native island had preferred the gleam of gold to the radiance of truth. Ahead lay Magna Graecia, the rugged and beautiful shores of southern Italy, where time had not yet frozen into the rigid forms of old traditions. This was a space of freedom, awaiting its sculptor. The voyage across the Ionian Sea became for Pythagoras a time of deep meditation. He spoke little with his companions, immersed in the contemplation of the rhythmic motion of the oars and the measured sound of the waves. In this monotony, he heard the pulse of being itself. For him, navigation was the highest form of prayer. The captain charted the course by the stars, submitting the will of the elements to the laws of geometry. Pythagoras reflected on what his brotherhood should be. He understood that mere instruction in mathematics was not enough. The world needed people whose inner life would be as harmonious as the movement of the planets. The sea, devoid of familiar landmarks, helped him cut away all that was superfluous and concentrate on the essential framework of his future teaching. He encoded in his mind the rules by which his disciples would live: silence, asceticism, and the unceasing search for beauty in numbers. The air gradually grew different, more dense, saturated with the aromas of wild herbs and sun-warmed earth. When the rocky outlines of Cape Licinium appeared on the horizon, Pythagoras felt a strange surge of strength. This was the land of Croton, a city renowned for its athletes and austere ways. The entrance into the harbor was solemn and quiet. The city greeted them with powerful stone walls and a majestic temple of Hera rising above the cliff. Pythagoras saw in this a favorable sign. Croton did not possess the softness of the Ionian cities here. Discipline and strength of spirit were still valued. Such soil was necessary to plant the tree of wisdom, whose roots would sink into the abyss of centuries, and whose branches would touch the stars. As he stepped ashore, Pythagoras involuntarily drew the attention of the crowd gathered in the port. His tall figure and dazzling white garments, the calmness of his movements, and his unusual deep gaze created around him a zone of inexplicable attraction. People accustomed to the noise of merchants and the shouts of sailors suddenly fell silent as he passed by. This was that same filled silence of which he had spoken in the introduction. Pythagoras did not hasten to begin preaching. He walked through the streets of Croton, absorbing the rhythm of this city, studying the faces of passers-by, and feeling his inner tuning fork adjust to a new frequency. He understood that here, in this austere land, the foundation of the school that would change the course of history was to be laid. His first meeting with the city elders took place in the main square. Pythagoras stood before them, and his speech, devoid of the ornate embellishments of the sophists, struck them with its crystalline logic and spiritual power. He spoke of how a state should be built on the same principles as the cosmos on justice, measure, and harmony. The elders, accustomed to deciding earthly affairs, suddenly felt the presence of something eternal. The moment when the silence around Pythagoras became almost tangible marked the beginning of a new era. He ceased to be a wanderer and became a teacher. The anticipation of a great work filled his heart. The labor of transforming human chaos into divine cosmos had officially begun on this blessed Italian soil. The doors of the school of Pythagoras opened not for those who knew how to count, but for those who had learned to be silent, for only in absolute silence is true understanding of number born. In Croton, an era of great transformation had begun, when the old laws of brute force started to yield before the dictatorship of spirit and reason. The founding of the Brotherhood became for the city an almost mystical event. Pythagoras constructed a complex hierarchy in which the path to light began with complete humility before the grandeur of the unknown. Those who wished to partake of his wisdom had to pass through years of severe trials. The first stage was that of the Acusmatici, the listeners, who remained behind a dense veil and could only heed the voice of the master without seeing his face. This was a test of patience, in which the disciple learned to absorb knowledge not through argument, but through deep inner contemplation. Pythagoras believed that before allowing the mind to reason, one must teach it to listen to that soundless rhythm upon which the entire universe rests. The daily life of the White Brotherhood was governed by a strict discipline, resembling the coordinated mechanism of a clock. Each morning began with solitary walks along shaded avenues, so that a man might attune his thoughts to a harmonious key before meeting others. Personal property within the community was completely absent. Every new member transferred his wealth into the common treasury, embracing the principle of friendship as the highest form of equality. Communal meals were simple and moderate, while physical exercises and music served as instruments for the purification of soul and body. Pythagoras committed an audacity unheard of in those times by opening the doors of his school to women. One of his most prominent followers became Theano, whose wisdom and virtue proved that the striving for truth knows no boundaries of gender. This was a union of equals in spirit, where each sought to become a living embodiment of that proportion which they studied in their mathematical treatises. In the evening, when the sun sank below the horizon and the noises of the city grew quiet, the time arrived for the chief ritual self-examination. Every Pythagorean had to pose to himself 3 questions. What have I done? In what have I transgressed? What duty have I left unfulfilled? This inner judgment allowed a man not merely to accumulate facts, but to transform his character. With time, the school grew into a powerful intellectual and political force, reshaping the very mores of all Croton. From within the walls of the Brotherhood emerged people of a new formation for whom justice was not an empty word, but a mathematical necessity. Pythagoras witnessed how his theory of harmony ceased to be an abstract theorem and became embodied in the living social fabric. He had created not merely a school, but a model of the ideal cosmos on Earth, where each participant was a tuned string in a great symphony. The white garments of his disciples became a symbol of purity and hope for all who sought anchorage in a shifting world. And though the shadows of future conflicts still lay ahead, at this moment the Brotherhood stood at the zenith of its greatness, illuminating the path toward light for all of ancient Greece. Pythagoras was the only mortal whose ear was pure enough to hear the great symphony of the planets revolving in the bottomless silence of the cosmos. To an ordinary man, the sky remained a mute dome, studded with the cold sparks of stars, but for the master, it was filled with solemn and powerful sound. He taught his followers that each celestial body, in its eternal motion along circular orbits, produces a sound of a certain pitch. The swift movement of the moon gave one tone, the slow rotation of Saturn another, and together they formed a perfect cosmic chord. This celestial music was for Pythagoras the highest proof that the world was not a collection of random stones cast into the void. The universe revealed itself as a gigantic musical instrument, its strings tuned by the divine mind itself. Men did not hear this music only because they had grown accustomed to it from the very first moment of their existence, just as those who live by the sea cease to notice the eternal roar of the surf. Only through the purification of the mind and profound silence could one approach an understanding of this heavenly order. To demonstrate his theory, Pythagoras used the monochord, a simple instrument with a single string and a movable bridge. With this device, he showed his students clearly and directly that the harmony of sound depends on geometric proportion. When he divided the string in half, an octave was born. When he pressed it at 2/3 of its length, a fifth emerged. This was one of the greatest discoveries in human history. The art of music, long considered a gift of the capricious muses, revealed itself as a strict mathematical discipline. Number had become the voice of reality. Pythagoras understood that the same intervals governed both the vibration of a string on an instrument and the distances between the planets in the night sky. This knowledge gave man the key to governing his own soul. In the Brotherhood, they used special melodies to heal the spirit, believing that a properly tuned mode could tame anger, banish sorrow, or prepare the mind for its encounter with eternity during sleep. Music was not entertainment. It was sacred mathematics, capable of restoring man to his original divine state. In those moments when Pythagoras would stand still on a mountaintop, his face turned to the cold wind, he saw before him not merely a nocturnal landscape, but a living, singing structure. The stars were for him not simply points of light, but notes in an infinite score composed by the great architect. This realization filled his heart with deep peace. He knew that even if cities fell and empires turned to dust, this music would sound forever. Number had become for him not merely a tool of calculation, but the divine language in which God speaks to the world. Every breath and every heartbeat was part of this universal symphony, and the task of the philosopher was to attune his life to this celestial orchestra. The universe sang of perfection, and Pythagoras, closing his eyes, allowed this sound to flow through him, becoming one with the infinite and beautiful cosmos. He understood that he had found the great secret of existence behind the visible chaos of matter. There always dwells an invisible, eternal, and perfectly tuned harmony of the spheres, accessible only to those who are willing to dedicate their lives to the search for truth in silence. The most sacred oath of the Pythagoreans was sworn not in the name of a god, but in the name of the holy Tetractys, a triangular figure of 10 points in which the entire fullness of the cosmos was encoded. To an outside observer, this drawing in the sand or on marble might have seemed merely a simple geometric curiosity, but for the initiate, it was the key to understanding the very laws by which reality is built. Pythagoras taught that within this concise figure, composed of 4 rows, lay hidden the path from divine unity to the material world. At the summit shone a single point, the monad, symbol of the origin of all things and of pure reason. Below it rested 2 points, giving birth to the line and to separation. The third row of 3 points created the plane and the first triangle, and the base of 4 points gave the world volume and the density of bodily existence. Together, they formed the decad, the perfect number which completes the cycle and returns all that exists to its source. In this triangle, Pythagoras saw not merely numbers, but the very architecture of the cosmos, where each row corresponded to one of the 4 elements: fire, air, water, and earth. The Tetractys was for the Brotherhood a living altar, before which all disputes fell silent, for its proportions were undeniable and eternal. To comprehend the Tetractys gave the disciples power over the understanding of harmony itself, for within this figure were encoded all the principal musical intervals that Pythagoras had previously discovered. The relationships between the rows of points gave birth to those pure sounds that caress the ear and heal the soul: the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. This was visible proof that space and sound, the seen and the unseen, obey one and the same mathematical logic. The oath sworn by the Tetractys was considered unbreakable, because to betray this symbol meant to betray the very structure of the universe and to introduce chaos into the divine order. Pythagoras explained that a man who has grasped the essence of the 10 points ceases to be a slave to circumstance. He begins to see the world as a single whole, where the movement of the smallest grain of dust is connected to the rotation of the starry spheres through the invisible threads of sacred proportions. The Tetractys served as a bridge between the human mind and the divine plan, allowing a mortal to touch eternity through the contemplation of simple and clear forms. It was a mirror of God, in which was reflected the truth about the origin of life and the purpose of human existence. In the deep silence of the night hall, when moonlight fell upon the stone slab engraved with the Tetractys, Pythagoras would often gather his most faithful followers. In such moments, he would tell them that the decad was not an end, but a new beginning on a higher level of consciousness. He taught them to see behind the points the pulsation of living energy that permeates every atom. The Tetractys united within itself arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, becoming the foundation of what would later be called the quadrivium of the sciences. This was the greatest achievement of his thought, the reduction of the entire diversity of the universe to one simple and beautiful scheme. In comprehending the Tetractys, the disciples came to realize that they themselves were part of this great triangle of life. Their bodies obey the number 4, their senses, the number 3, their reason, the number 2, and their immortal spark forever yearned for the one at the summit. Thus the symbol became a map of inner ascent. Pythagoras knew that as long as men remembered the secret of the 10 points, the truth of the world's harmony would not be lost, and humanity would always be able to find its way back to the light through the darkness of any delusion. The Tetractys remained an unwavering beacon, pointing the way to perfection in a world where all else was subject to decay and destruction. The golden verses of Pythagoras were not merely rules of conduct, but an encrypted method for tuning the human soul to the pure frequency of eternity. In a world where men often lost themselves in the chaos of passions and fleeting desires, this ethical code served as an unshakable foundation, transforming daily existence into a conscious service to harmony. Pythagoras taught that philosophy has no meaning if it does not change the man himself, his habits, his way of seeing the world. Each saying was like the blow of a hammer upon red-hot metal, forging from an imperfect mortal being a true aristocrat of the spirit. The code began with the recognition of the hierarchy of the cosmos, reverence for the immortal gods and heroes, which symbolized the acceptance of the higher order established by number. But this was only the beginning of the path. The true work took place within, where each disciple was to become the absolute master of his own senses. The taming of anger, gluttony, and laziness was seen not as harsh punishment, but as the necessary hygiene of the mind. The body in the Brotherhood was regarded as a precious instrument, which must be perfectly tuned so as not to distort the music of the higher spheres with its coarse and dissonant noise. Only in a pure vessel could truth be held, without spilling or being defiled by earthly filth. At the center of the golden verses stood the demand for absolute truthfulness and justice. Pythagoras insisted that no word should be cast to the wind without good reason. The speech of a philosopher must be as precise as a geometric theorem and as weighty as a bar of gold. The disciples learned to cherish silence, understanding that in empty chatter, the vital energy necessary for the contemplation of the Tetractys was drained away. But the deepest and most effective instrument of transformation was the evening ritual of self-examination. Before closing his eyes and sinking into healing sleep, the Pythagorean would mentally return 3 times to the events of the day that had passed. He would ask himself what good he had done, where he had erred, and what duty remained unfulfilled. This process allowed a man not to accumulate the burden of unresolved problems and unforgiven grievances, but to cleanse his conscience daily, preparing his consciousness for new levels of understanding. Thus life became an unceasing labor upon oneself, where every deed was weighed on the scales of divine justice. It was an alchemy of the spirit, slowly turning the lead of ordinariness into the gold of conscious existence. The verses concluded with a solemn promise of immortality for those who would manage to follow this thorny yet luminous path to the end. Pythagoras affirmed that the soul, purified of earthly attachments and attuned to cosmic harmony, could break the wheel of rebirth. Adherence to the code led to this. After the death of the material shell, the mind did not dissolve into nothingness, but merged with the pure ether, becoming part of the eternal light. This was the highest goal of the teaching, to transform man into a divinity, returning him to the source from which he once came. The golden verses were the map of this return, tested by centuries and by thousands of followers. In the eyes of Pythagoras, morality was not a set of prohibitions, but a mathematical necessity to enter into resonance with the perfect cosmos. One must become perfect oneself. This code transformed the Brotherhood into a single, harmoniously functioning organism, where each member was a living note in a great symphony. Gazing upon his disciples, clothed in white robes and observing silence, the Master saw not merely men, but the dawn of a new humanity, capable of living according to the laws of eternal beauty and divine number. The shadow of destruction fell upon the threshold of the Brotherhood, not from the depths of the cosmos, but from the wounded pride of a single man whose mind was too turbid for the pure light of Pythagoras. Cylon, possessing immense wealth and immeasurable arrogance, believed that his status granted him the right to all the secrets of the universe. He came to the doors of the school demanding initiation, as if he were buying goods at the market. But he encountered something that could not be purchased with gold. Pythagoras, looking into his eyes, saw there only a thirst for power and an incapacity for silence. The master refused him, understanding that to admit such a man into the fellowship would be to poison the very root of harmony. For Cylon, this refusal became a mortal insult that transformed his sympathy into venomous hatred. He could not forgive that he, the most influential man in Croton, had been deemed unworthy of the white robes. From that moment, Cylon devoted all his life and resources to a single goal, the complete destruction of Pythagoras and all his legacy. He began to skillfully weave webs of conspiracy, exploiting the basest fears of the crowd. Rumors spread through the city that the Pythagoreans were plotting tyranny and sought to deprive the people of their freedom, hiding behind strange rituals and incomprehensible calculations. Fear of the unknown is always stronger than love of truth, and soon the seeds of enmity bore their bitter fruit among those who, only yesterday, had bowed before the wisdom of the fellowship. The political atmosphere in Croton reached its peak when Cylon openly called upon the people to take vengeance upon the philosophers. He claimed that the secrecy of the school was a sign of a conspiracy against democracy, and that the communal property of the Pythagoreans threatened every homeowner. On one fateful night, when the leading members of the Brotherhood had gathered in the house of the famous athlete Milo to discuss pressing matters, an armed mob, incited by Cylon, surrounded the building. The air filled with cries of rage and the stench of smoke. Fanatics, their hearts blinded by lies, set the house on fire, determined to burn knowledge along with its bearers. In this inferno, the Pythagoreans displayed the highest degree of self-possession. It is said that they lay down in the flames, creating a bridge with their bodies so that their teacher might escape the burning building unharmed. This was the last and most terrible test of loyalty to harmony. The fire of envy blazed that night brighter than the stars they had so loved to contemplate. The great library and sacred instruments were consumed by the flames, and many disciples perished, preserving to the end that same majestic silence which Pythagoras had taught them. The tragedy at Croton marked the end of the golden age of the Brotherhood as a unified organization, transforming the living community into scattered groups of refugees. Pythagoras was forced to leave Croton, the city he had made great, and which had ultimately betrayed him. He departed into exile, watching as the smoke from the pyre rose to the night sky, obscuring the light of the constellations. In his heart, there was no malice toward the murderers, only a deep sorrow that humanity was not yet ready to embrace number without the admixture of blood. The master understood that Cylon had destroyed only walls and bodies, but he was powerless against the very idea of harmony. The disciples, scattered throughout Italy and Greece, carried the sparks of this knowledge further, making it immortal. Pythagoras made his way to Metapontum, knowing that his earthly journey was drawing to a close. He saw in this destruction the natural cycle of the Tetractys. After flourishing comes decay, to make way for new birth on another level. The blood on the steps of the school became the ink with which the final, most bitter chapter of his teaching was inscribed. Cylon celebrated his victory, but he did not understand that by his crime he had only succeeded in transforming Pythagoras into a legend. The wisdom that could not be bought had now become the possession of eternity, and no fire could destroy that music of the spheres which the Master had once revealed to the world. The Brotherhood fell, but its spirit lived on in everyone who continued to seek truth in silence and in numbers, defying the fury of the ignorant mob in the shadows of human pride. Metapontum became for Pythagoras not merely a refuge from the fury of Cylon, but a sacred hermitage where in 40 days of silence a new form of immortality for his ideas was forged. When the ash of the Croton pyre was still settling on the roads of southern Italy, the master arrived at the shores of the Gulf of Taranto, not as a defeated old man, but as one who had fulfilled his earthly duty. The people of Metapontum received him with reverent awe, offering him shelter in the quiet of the Temple of the Muses, which became his last earthly citadel. Pythagoras understood that the time of active community building was complete, and that the hour had come to transform philosophy into an unassailable myth. He willingly chose the path of the deepest asceticism, abstaining from food and from external communication, so that in a 40-day fast he might refine his mind to a state of absolute transparency. In this voluntary confinement, he did not merely mourn his fallen friends, but constructed an inner temple impervious to the fire of fanatics or the envy of tyrants. Every moment of this silence was filled with a re-examination of the path he had traveled, from the shores of Samos to the ziggurats of Babylon. Pythagoras realized that the physical presence of the teacher would soon become unnecessary, for true knowledge must live in the hearts of his followers as an independent and living force. His 40 days in Metapontum became the great transition from a man of flesh and blood into the eternal symbol of number. The news of the smoldering embers of the Croton school reached Metapontum as a muffled echo, but the master received it with unshakable calm, seeing in destruction only the natural cycle of the Tetractys. He taught the few remaining disciples that the death of form is merely the condition for the liberation of essence. If Croton had been the birthplace of the Brotherhood, then Metapontum became the place of its spiritual transformation. Here, in the shadow of the columns, Pythagoras prepared the world for his absence, passing on the final keys to understanding the harmony of the spheres. His withdrawal into seclusion was an act of the highest pedagogy. He demonstrated that the true sage does not depend on external circumstances and is able to preserve the inner cosmos even at the epicenter of catastrophe. The disciples watched as their teacher grew ever more ethereal and luminous day by day, as if his body were gradually transforming into a pure geometric idea. Metapontum became a point of silence in the midst of the raging sea of ancient history, where for the last time in human form dwelt the one who had heard the music of the stars. It was a time of great farewell, and, at the same time, of a great promise of eternal life. The chapter culminates in a moment of supreme spiritual tension, when the boundaries between the living prophet and the immortal number finally dissolve in the radiance of the setting sun. Pythagoras sat on the steps of the temple, gazing at the sea, and in his gaze was reflected the entire infinity of the Tetractys. He knew that his physical departure would be but the beginning of a new chapter, in which his ideas would sprout through the centuries, inspiring future seekers of truth. His silence in Metapontum was louder than any speech. It laid the foundation for that secret teaching which would survive in the underground chambers and libraries of ages to come. The grief for the fallen fellowship gave way to a solemn awareness of the indestructibility of the spirit. The master departed into the light, leaving behind not merely theorems and rules, but a living spark of the divine mind, capable of illuminating humanity's path through the darkest of times. Thus ended the earthly biography of Pythagoras, yielding its place to his infinite life in the world of ideas, where there is no death, only the eternal return to harmony. Metapontum became the portal through which Pythagoras stepped into eternity, becoming that very music which he had once revealed to the world, and now this symphony was ready to sound for everyone willing to listen for it in the silence of their own soul. The persecution only strengthened the faith of those who survived, transforming the open school into a secret order where every number became a password and every theorem a sacred cipher. When the fires in Croton died down and the fury of Cylon encountered the emptiness of exile, it became clear that an idea cannot be conquered by the sword. Scattered throughout the Greek world, the surviving Pythagoreans became invisible guardians of a flame that no longer needed the walls of a single house. They departed for Taras, for Phlius, for Thebes, carrying in their hearts and memories what could not be burned. Now their appearance changed. The white robes gave way to the simple cloaks of wanderers, but the gleam in their eyes and the precision of their thought revealed their belonging to a higher order. Every meeting of two brothers in dusty port cities became a silent ritual of recognition through symbols traced in the sand or through particular gestures. The teaching, having lost its center in Croton, transformed into a global network permeating the entire Mediterranean. This was a time of spiritual resistance, when the silence their master had taught them became their chief protection and their most effective weapon against the ignorance of the crowd. The secret archives saved from the fire were carefully copied and passed on only to those who had undergone rigorous tests of character. The knowledge of the Tetractys and the music of the spheres became an elite treasure, its access now guarded more strictly than ever before. In this new underground existence, Pythagorean thought began to assume its final form. The disciples understood that their task was not merely to preserve texts, but to embed the laws of harmony into the very fabric of Greek politics and science. Remarkable figures such as Archytas of Terrace prove that a philosopher could successfully govern a city if his actions were founded upon mathematical justice. The Pythagoreans did not seek vengeance for their fallen brothers. They sought the opportunity to continue the great work of ordering chaos. Their lives became living proof that wisdom can survive under any conditions if it is deeply rooted in eternal truths. At the same time, the figure of Pythagoras himself began to undergo a rapid transformation in the consciousness of his followers. Stories of his miracles, of his golden thigh, and of his ability to hear the heavens became embellished with new details, turning the teacher's biography into a sacred myth. He was no longer merely a man from Samos. He became a demigod whose presence was felt in every solved problem and in every sound of the lyre. Thus was born the legend that would nourish the minds of thinkers for the next 2,000 years. The teaching became a universal language of reason, accessible to anyone willing to rise above earthly vanity. The death of the school in Croton proved, in reality, to be its true rebirth on the scale of an entire civilization. Scattered sparks ignited thousands of other fires of knowledge. The Pythagoreans learned to operate in secrecy, influencing the minds of future lawgivers and philosophers through personal mentorship and the transmission of encrypted scrolls. They became the invisible architects of that edifice of Western thought which we know today. The chapter concludes with the sense that the Echo of Croton does not fade, but, on the contrary, grows stronger, resonating in every new discovery and in every human attempt to understand the structure of the universe. The master departed, but his number became the foundation for a new religion of reason. In the silence of secret gatherings, where geometric proportions were studied by candlelight, the future of science and art was forged. This chapter is a hymn to the resilience of human intellect, capable of turning tragedy into triumph and exile into a great mission. The Pythagorean fellowship ceased to be a place and became a state of consciousness, accessible to every seeker of truth, wherever they might be. The path through darkness and persecution only confirmed the purity of their golden verses. Thus began the long journey of a legacy that would lead to the dialogues of Plato and the discoveries of Renaissance scholars. The music of the spheres continued to sound, and its echo now spread across the world, reminding all that harmony is eternal, while hatred and destruction are but fleeting shadows against the radiance of the shining Tetractys. Mathematics was for the Brotherhood a prayer in numbers, where every equality served as irrefutable proof that God is the great geometer who knows no error. Pythagoras taught that behind the changing world of things, subject to decay and dissolution, there lies an unshakable framework of eternal truths, which can neither be seen with the eye nor touched with the hands. Geometry was for him not an applied craft for measuring land, but a sacred act of knowing the divine mind. Every point, every line, every plane was perceived as a step on a ladder leading to the throne of the cosmic intelligence. In the silence of their halls, the disciples bent over their diagrams not for profit, but to feel the shiver of awe before the face of absolute truth. The most famous discovery of Pythagoras, the relationship of the sides in a right triangle, became for the fellowship a metaphysical revelation about the balance of forces in the universe. In this equality of areas, they saw a manifestation of supreme justice. The squares of the legs, like two sacrificial bowls, exactly balanced the square of the hypotenuse. This was visible proof that nothing in the world happens by chance, and that every force always finds its mirror reflection in the universal order of things. The joy of realizing this harmony was so great that, according to tradition, the master offered a hecatomb in gratitude to the gods, the sacrifice of 100 oxen, even though the Brotherhood usually preached mercy towards all living beings. In that moment, human reason had touched the very essence of creation, and this triumph of the spirit demanded grand acknowledgement. For the Pythagoreans, things were but fleeting shadows cast by eternal numbers upon the wall of the cave of our perception. The true substance of the world was considered to be number, the fundamental element from which the fabric of existence is woven, from the clusters of stars to the smallest grains of sand. The theorem became an eternal monument to this conviction. It taught that beneath all complexity lies a simple and clear rule connecting space and measure. The square, as a number multiplied by itself, was revered as a symbol of absolute stability and divine perfection, knowing no flaw. In studying geometry, the disciples simultaneously studied ethics. If the sides of a triangle are obliged to obey the law of equality, then the actions of a man must also be commensurate with the demands of the highest good. This was a mathematical ethics, where vice was considered a violation of proportion and virtue, a return to harmonious number. Every solved problem was for them a small victory of light over the darkness of ignorance. Pythagoras saw in geometry the only language in which a mortal could conduct a dialogue with the Creator without intermediaries and ambiguous prophecies. The eternity of this language guaranteed that truth would remain unchanged even after thousands of years, when temples would fall and great empires would vanish. The theorem was not merely a schoolroom rule. It was the seal of God upon the face of reality, confirming that reason is a full citizen of the heavenly homeland. The chapter concludes with the profound realization that geometry is the highest form of music, and music the highest form of geometry. Pythagoras sat before a diagram on the marble floor, and in his eyes was reflected all the complexity and simplicity of the cosmos. He understood that as long as measure and number exist, man would never be alone in this boundless void. The theorem of the squares of the sides became for him an invisible anchor, holding the mind back from falling into the abyss of madness and chaos. This equality would bind humanity to the mind of the Creator throughout all ages, becoming the foundation for future discoveries and great edifices. As long as two legs give birth to a hypotenuse, according to an unbreakable law, order and meaning are preserved in the world. Mathematics as a prayer purified the hearts of those who dared to look beyond the veil of the visible, transforming dry numbers into the living energy of creation. Pythagoras knew that his theorem would outlive him, becoming an eternal hymn to the human intellect that had managed to read the first lines in the book of divine blueprints. Geometry granted them immortality while still alive, allowing them to touch that which is not subject to decay and time. In this triumph of logic and beauty lay the chief secret of the Brotherhood. The world is beautiful because it can be measured, and it can be measured because behind it stands the great geometer. Thus number was finally transformed into divinity, and the theorem into a sacred scripture, inscribed not with ink on papyrus, but by the very structure of eternal space. Pythagoras looked upon the world as upon a vast stage, where one and the same immortal soul tries on thousands of different masks, from the simple field flower to the great king. For him, death was not a final silence or an abyss of non-being, but merely a change of scenery in the infinite drama of the spirit's self-knowledge. The teaching of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, became the bridge that connected the transient world of matter with the eternal world of number. The Master affirmed that the soul is an invisible unit, a spark of divine fire, condemned to a long journey through the cycle of rebirths until it attains absolute purity. Each new incarnation was for him a lesson in the great school of the cosmos, where grades were assigned not by teachers, but by the very structure of existence. If a man lived his life in harmony with the Tetractys, his soul ascended higher, towards more perfect forms of being. If he surrendered to chaos and passions, the weight of his transgressions dragged him downward into the bodies of animals, or even into the stillness of plants. Pythagoras did not merely preach this as a theory. He claimed to possess the gift of remembering his past lives. He described how he had once been the hero Euphorbus, and fought beneath the walls of Troy, and even recognized his ancient shield in a temple at Argos. This unbroken memory was his chief weapon against the fear of death, transforming the history of his eye into an endless golden chain of events. This profound conviction in the kingship of all living things gave rise within the Brotherhood to a strict code of mercy. The Pythagoreans became the first vegetarians of the ancient world, not out of concern for health, but from deep metaphysical compassion. They believed that in every creature, whether a faithful dog or a plowing ox, there might dwell the soul of an old friend or ancestor, passing through its own cycle of purification. The killing of an animal was equated with a crime against life itself, a violation of the cosmic balance. This teaching transformed the world into a single pulsating organism where there are no strangers, only brothers at different stages of the same path. The wheel of rebirth turned inexorably, and the only way to step off it lay in the complete purification of the mind through mathematics and music. Philosophy was for Pythagoras not mere reflection, but a practice of soul salvation. By comprehending eternal proportions, a man tuned his inner purity to the frequency of the divine ether, preparing himself for the moment when the next mask would be cast off forever, and the soul, freed from the shackles of flesh, would return to the radiant bosom of the primal source. This was the promise of ultimate freedom, which made the disciples fearless in the face of any earthly tragedy. Now, falling still on the seashore, Pythagoras listened to the sound of the surf, which seemed to him the whisper of millions of souls seeking their way to the light. In every chance encounter he saw not the play of blind coincidence, but the continuation of an ancient dialogue begun in time immemorial. Death in his world was merely a pause between measures, a time of rest before a new, more perfect chord. The number of life must always remain positive, so that the sum of all incarnations might lead to a final equation with the divine mind. Beyond the horizon new suns were rising, and souls, changing their garments of flesh, continued their tireless ascent up the invisible steps of the Tetractys. Death was conquered by wisdom, and time became merely a tool for cutting the diamond of the human spirit. In this grand movement there is no place for oblivion, only infinite development in the rays of the eternal harmony of the spheres, where each of us is but a note striving to become part of a flawless symphony. For Pythagoras, numbers were not dead marks on papyrus. They were living essences, possessing gender, character, and the magical power of creation. In every digit he saw not merely a tool for commercial calculation, but a divine archetype, a spark of reason embodied in strict form. The disciples of the Brotherhood learned not to count numbers, but to contemplate them, listening to their silent voice. The Master divided all numerical multiplicity into two great camps, the even and the odd, seeing in this division the fundamental struggle between limit and the limitless. Odd numbers were considered masculine, bearing light, order, and stability, while even numbers embodied the feminine principle, fluid, undefined, and infinite. The entire world appeared to Pythagoras as the result of an eternal union between these two principles. Arithmetic in his hands became a sacred chronicle of creation, where the one, the monad, was the father, a shining point of rest and absolute unity from which all existence flowed. The two, the first dyad, became the mother, a symbol of division, doubt, and extension. Their union gave birth to the three, the first completed number, forming a plane and restoring stability to the world. Thus, step by step, numbers built the framework of reality, transforming chaos into ordered cosmos. Every number in the Pythagorean system possessed its own unique destiny and mystical weight. The 5 was revered as a symbol of marriage, uniting the first even and the first odd number in an unbreakable union. The 7 was considered the number of chance and critical moments, governing health and the rhythms of human life. The 10 stood above all as divine perfection, containing within itself all the possibilities of existence. Pythagoras taught that comprehending the magical nature of numbers granted a man power over his own destiny, allowing him to tune his mind into resonance with the rhythms of the universe. Numbers were for him not an abstraction, but the flesh and blood of the cosmos. When he looked at a blossoming flower or at the movement of clouds, he saw not merely the play of matter, but a dance of proportions where petals and drops of water obeyed a strict numerical hierarchy. This knowledge transformed the world into a transparent and understandable structure, where there was no place for blind chance. Number was the one language in which God spoke to man directly, without riddles or vague allegories, offering to everyone ready for knowledge the key to the heavenly gates. Falling still before the numbers inscribed on marble, the Pythagoreans felt the boundaries of their personalities dissolve into the ocean of eternal truths. We live inside a grand computational process, where every star and every thought is part of a single infinite equation. Pythagoras understood that behind the visible diversity of forms stands a single algorithm of love and harmony, expressed in flawless numerical relationships. By comprehending the magic of numbers, man ceased to be a grain of sand driven by the wind and became a conscious participant in the great construction. The silence of the school filled with the pulsation of these living essences, and in this sacred rhythm was born the understanding that the universe is a perfect mind expressing itself through number. In the final analysis, arithmetic became the highest form of ecstasy, where the soul, freed from the shackles of flesh, merged with the shining geometry of the Creator, becoming one of the eternal units of the great and beautiful Tetractys. Pythagoras taught that the body is a temple, and to fill it with the blood of other beings meant to desecrate the altar upon which only the pure lamp of reason should burn. In the ancient world, where animal sacrifice and noisy feasts were the foundation of life, the Brotherhood chose a path of striking detachment. For them, diet was not a matter of health or a whim, it was the foundation of spiritual hygiene. The master believed that coarse food, obtained through suffering and death, clouds the mirror of the soul, rendering it incapable of reflecting the subtle vibrations of the celestial spheres. The rejection of meat was a direct consequence of the teaching on metempsychosis, when you realize that in every living being there may dwell the spark of your ancestor or friend. The butcher's knife becomes an instrument of sacrilege. The Pythagorean table was a triumph of purity and simplicity. Bread, honey, fresh vegetables, and pure water, these gifts of the earth carried no memory of pain, allowing the mind to remain light and agile, ready for the most complex mathematical ascents. A special place in the school's rule was held by the mysterious prohibition against eating beans, a rule that caused bewilderment among contemporaries and debate among later generations. For the initiates, this taboo was filled with deep symbolism. Pythagoras saw in beings not merely food, but carriers of primordial life force, seeds in which the spirit, not yet having taken form, lies dormant. To touch them meant to interfere with the sacred process of becoming. Furthermore, the master insisted on complete abstinence from wine and from any excesses that might disturb the clarity of consciousness. Every meal in the Brotherhood became a quiet ritual, where food was perceived as fuel for the sacred fire of thought. Communal meals took place in deep silence, broken only by the reading of wise texts or the sounds of the lyre. Such discipline of the body allowed the disciples to attain states inaccessible to ordinary people. Their dreams became transparent and prophetic, and their senses sharpened to such a degree that the world began to shine with new colors. Purifying their flesh, the Pythagoreans prepared themselves for the highest contemplation. When the body ceases to dictate its coarse desires, the mind gains wings. Pythagoras looked upon his disciples, gathered around a simple meal, and saw in them not merely people, but perfect instruments, tuned in unison with the divine order. Moderation was for them not a deprivation, but a liberation from the tyranny of matter. In this quiet victory over appetite was born that inner silence in which alone the voice of truth can sound. The path to the stars began with what a man placed in his bowl, and every sip of pure water brought him closer to the awareness of his unity with the eternal and beautiful cosmos. Thus, through the discipline of the table, the Brotherhood forged a new type of human being, one free from fear, greed, and violence, ready to become a living embodiment of that harmony about which the planets sang in the night sky. The opposition between the Acusmatici and the Mathematici became the first dispute in history between faith and science, born in the very heart of Pythagorean silence. Within the fellowship, which aspired to absolute harmony, an invisible crack appeared, dividing the disciples into two camps according to their way of perceiving truth. On one side stood the Acusmatici, the zealous guardians of tradition, whose name derived from the word listening. For them, every word of the master was a sacred dogma not subject to discussion. They memorized brief sayings. The Acusmata saw in the prohibitions on eating beings or in the rules for putting on sandals a mystical connection with the divine, and believed that the salvation of the soul lay in the precise observance of ritual. For long years the Acusmatici languished behind a thick veil, hearing only the voice of Pythagoras without seeing his face, which transformed their devotion into a deep, almost religious feeling. For them, wisdom was a bequeathed treasure to be guarded from distortion without asking unnecessary questions. Opposing them were the Mathematici, those who yearn not merely to believe, but to understand the inner mechanics of the universe. For this group, the teaching of Pythagoras was not a frozen set of rules, but a living language of proofs and logical deductions. The Mathematici were admitted to the inner circle, where the veil fell away, revealing to them the master and the diagrams drawn in the sand. They saw in numbers not magical amulets, but tools of knowledge, demanding that every theorem be substantiated by strict reason. This division laid bare the eternal conflict of human consciousness, the need for a comprehensible myth, and the thirst for pure logos. While the Acusmatici concentrated on ethics and rituals, the Mathematici laid the foundation for future physics and astronomy. The tension between them grew, foreshadowing the future dissolution of the school, when each side would begin to claim the right to be called the sole true heir of Pythagoras. The master himself served as the sole bridge between these two worlds, understanding that truth needs both wings. He knew that most people require law and symbol to keep from losing their way in the chaos of life, but a chosen few need the light of pure knowledge to move humanity forward. Pythagoras saw in the Acusmatici the roots of his tree, firmly holding it in the soil of tradition, and in the Mathematici, the branches reaching for the stars. The conflict within the Brotherhood became a prototype for all of Western civilization, which would for centuries oscillate between revelation and experiment. In the silence of the school, where some prayed over formulas and others over parables, there was born the realization that the world is too vast to fit into a single system of views. The harmony of which Pythagoras had so long taught must now undergo its ultimate test, to reconcile the faith of the heart with the cold brilliance of reason beneath the dome of the common starry sky. Plato became that very echo of Pythagoras, which transformed the secret whisper of the Brotherhood into the resonant foundation of all European thought. When the young Athenian philosopher first traveled to Magna Graecia, he sought not merely new knowledge, but a way to reconcile the chaos of human politics with the eternal order of the heavens. In Taurus, beneath the shade of olive groves, he met Archytas, the last great Pythagorean who governed the city with compass and profound humanity. This meeting became for Plato a true initiation. He saw that the dreams of his teacher Socrates about justice take on flesh only when they rest upon the unshakable foundation of mathematics. Plato understood if the world of numbers is flawless, then the world of ideas must also obey the laws of proportion. Returning to Athens, he founded the Academy, above whose entrance he inscribed the stern warning, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This was a direct echo of Croton, proclaiming that the path to truth lies not through empty arguments in the marketplace, but through the rigorous purification of the mind by geometry. The Pythagorean heritage permeated the deepest layers of Platonic philosophy, transforming dry calculations into the majestic theory of ideas. In his famous dialogue, Timaeus, Plato described the demiurge as the great architect who creates the universe by gazing upon eternal mathematical models. He borrowed from the Brotherhood the teaching that the cosmos is ordered by musical intervals, and that the human soul is also a harmony which must be constantly tuned. Even his ideal state was an attempt to transpose the rule of the Pythagorean fellowship onto the scale of an entire people, where philosopher rulers are like the Mathematici, seeing the hidden order behind the noise of everyday life. Plato did not merely quote Pythagoras. He breathed new life into his secret knowledge, making it accessible to all humanity. Thanks to him, numbers ceased to be only magical symbols and became logical categories upon which all modern science and culture would later be built. Gazing at the starry sky, Plato saw in it not a random cluster of lights, but a living embodiment of the Pythagorean Tetractys, unfolded into infinity. He became the bridge by which the wisdom of the ancient master passed from the shadow of temples into the bright halls of libraries. The Tragedy of Croton and the silence of Metapontum found their redemption in the resonant lines of Plato's dialogues, which carried the news of divine number to every corner of the inhabited world. Pythagoras remained the invisible co-author of humanity's greatest thoughts, acting through Plato's hand like a hidden harmony guiding the movement of the bow. In this union of two geniuses was born the dream of a world where reason is the highest law, and beauty is the direct consequence of mathematical truth. Thus the whisper born in the silence of the Pythagorean fellowship found immortality, becoming an eternal hymn to the human spirit, capable of reading the blueprints of the Creator himself. In the geometry of Pythagoras were hidden 5 perfect solids, in which was encoded the very anatomy of the elements, from the sharp flame of the tetrahedron to the mysterious void of the dodecahedron. For the Brotherhood, these figures were not merely exercises for the mind, they represented the genetic code of matter, those very primal forms from which the Creator built all that is visible and invisible. Pythagoras taught that chaos is tamed by number, and number takes on flesh in the regular polyhedrons. Each of these figures possessed its own unique character and governed one of the elements. The tetrahedron, with its sharp vertices and 4 faces, embodied the fury and penetration of fire. The stable cube was the foundation of earth, granting the world solidity and support. The octahedron, light and mobile, became the soul of air, and the icosahedron, composed of 20 triangles, held within itself the fluid and changeable essence of water. In this system, there was no place for chance. Nature appeared before the disciples as a giant constructor, where every grain of ash or drop of dew obeyed the strict symmetry of polyhedral crystals. Yet the most dangerous and sacred knowledge of the Brotherhood was the dodecahedron, a 12-faced solid whose faces, in the form of perfect pentagons, defied the imagination. If the first 4 figures built the earthly world, the dodecahedron was considered the symbol of the 5th element, or ether, that very subtle matter from which the celestial spheres and the souls of the gods are woven. For a long time, knowledge of it was kept under the strictest secrecy, for to touch the dodecahedron meant to touch the very fabric of the universe. A severe legend existed about Hippasus of Metapontum, who dared to reveal the secret of this sphere of 12 pentagons to the uninitiated. It was said that the gods grew angry and swallowed him in the depths of the sea for exposing the blueprint of the cosmos itself to public view. For the Pythagoreans, the dodecahedron was an image of completeness and divine rest, the form in which all existence is contained, just as the sky embraces the earth from all sides. By comprehending the secret polyhedrons, a man began to see the world not as a heap of objects, but as a shining crystal pulsating in the abyss. Pythagoras showed his disciples that the same geometry which governs the movement of the planets is hidden within an ordinary stone or in the structure of a honeycomb. The entire world is frozen music, embodied in flawless faces, where every point is connected to another by the will of a higher intelligence. In the silence of the school, contemplating models of these solids, the Pythagoreans felt their own minds tuning to the frequency of the Creator. This knowledge granted them peace. If at the foundation of the universe lie such perfect and unchanging forms, then even in human life, behind the temporary disorder, an eternal plan is concealed. Gazing at the starry dome, they saw in it the projection of a giant dodecahedron, where every face sings its own note in the infinite chorus of the elements, and we mortals are merely witnesses to this great and beautiful symphony of forms. 2,000 years before Copernicus, Pythagoras already knew that the earth is not the motionless center of the world, but a wandering sphere dancing around an invisible central fire. At a time when most people believed that the world was flat and rested on the backs of mythical creatures, within the walls of the Pythagorean fellowship, a cosmology was born that surpassed the centuries. The master taught that the cosmos is not a chaos of lights, but an ordered system where each celestial body occupies its place according to a strict mathematical hierarchy. At the center of this system he placed Hestia, the divine hearth, around which the planets, the moon, the sun, and our earth revolve in an eternal rhythm. For him, the spherical form of the planets was the only possible one, for the sphere is the ideal body in which every point on the surface is equally distant from the center, which is the highest embodiment of justice in geometry. This discovery transformed the sky from an abode of capricious gods into a giant clockwork mechanism operating according to the laws of number. Astronomy for the Pythagoreans was inseparably linked with music. They believed that each planet moving through the ether cuts through it at a certain speed, producing a sound of its own particular pitch. The farther the planet from the central fire and the swifter its course, the higher its note. Thus was born the great music of the spheres, a celestial symphony that we do not hear only because it has sounded continuously since our birth, becoming habitual silence. Pythagoras was the first to attempt to calculate the distances between the luminaries using the same intervals as on the strings of a lyre. The sky became for him a giant musical instrument upon which God himself plays. The disciples, studying the motion of the stars, learned to feel the rhythm of eternity itself. They realized that human life is but a tiny measure in this infinite composition, and the task of the philosopher is to tune his soul so that it does not play false in the universal chorus of the cosmos. Gazing at the night sky, the Pythagoreans saw in it not a cold abyss, but a shining proof that reason rules over matter. If the planets follow their prescribed paths and do not stray from orbit, then order is possible on Earth as well. This astronomy of the future gave humanity a new place in the universe. We ceased to be the center, but became full participants in a grand dance of light. Every eclipse and every rising of the constellations was perceived as the movement of a living, breathing organism. The Master passed on to his followers the knowledge that we live on a sphere flying through space, embraced by harmony on all sides. This realization freed them from fear of the unknown, turning the night darkness into an open book of divine mathematics. Thus, long before telescopes and the calculations of modern scientists, Pythagoras flung open the doors to infinity, allowing humanity to hear the first chords of that music which governs the movement of the stars and the beating of every heart. Medicine in the Brotherhood was the art of restoring proportion, where the physician acted as a musician, returning the out-of-tune body to its natural mathematical harmony. For the Pythagoreans, illness was not the punishing hand of the gods or a random misfortune, but merely a false note in the orchestra of the human organism. If the entire universe was created according to the laws of number and harmony, then man, as a microcosm, must also sound pure. Sickness arose precisely when these ideal proportions were disrupted, when some part of the soul or body fell out of the common rhythm. Healing, therefore, consisted not so much in expelling the disease, but in restoring the lost balance. Master Pythagoras himself was a skilled healer, and his method was based on a deep understanding of the interconnection between mind, emotions, and physical state. He believed that many sufferings are born from inner dissonance, which could be eliminated through properly selected sounds and thoughts. The main instrument in the arsenal of Pythagorean physicians was musical therapy. Specific modes and rhythms were used to treat various ailments. Melancholy was tamed by soft, descending melodies, anger and aggression by soothing harmonies, and insomnia by lulling lullabies. Before sleep and after awakening, the disciples sang special hymns which attuned the soul to calmness and clarity, driving away anxious thoughts. The diet, which we discussed earlier, also played a key role. Moderate, pure nourishment, without meat or excesses, maintained the inner number of the organism in ideal order. The Pythagoreans were among the first to recognize the importance of prevention, believing that it is better to prevent dissonance than to try to correct it afterwards. The eminent Pythagorean physician Eccho of Croton went further, investigating the brain itself as the center of consciousness and perception. He asserted that health is isonomia, or equilibrium, of opposing forces in the body, while illness is the predominance of one of them. Gazing at the starry sky, the Pythagoreans saw in it not only eternal geometry, but also a model of ideal health, where every planet moves along its orbit without fail. Man was for them a living musical instrument, which must sound pure in the universal chorus of the universe. Healing began not with bitter potions, but with the purification of the soul through silence and immersion in the rhythms of sacred hymns. Mathematical problems were also considered part of therapy, as they restored the logical clarity of the mind, dispersing the fog of anxiety and fear. Pythagoras knew that true health is not the absence of pain, but a deep feeling of unity with all that exists, an inner harmony that allows the soul to dance in time with the music of the spheres. Thus, medicine in his school ceased to be a set of empirical techniques and became the highest art of tuning the human spirit to the wave of divine perfection, making every Pythagorean not merely a disciple, but a living embodiment of cosmic harmony. To the uninitiated, Pythagoras spoke in riddles and his strange prohibitions. The refusal to eat beans or the command not to stir fire with a sword were not superstitions, but keys to a secret wisdom. In a world where every word could be misinterpreted, the master created a unique language of symbols, accessible only to those whose minds had been purified by years of silence. Each Acusma, each brief rule of the Brotherhood, carried a multi-layered ethical and philosophical meaning. When Pythagoras advised not to step over a scale, he was not concerned about the preservation of the instrument, but urged his disciples never to violate the boundaries of justice, and not to seek personal gain where equality should reign. The prohibition against eating the heart was a metaphor for the prohibition against deep sorrow, which consumes the soul from within. The injunction not to look into a mirror by lamplight reminded them that true self-knowledge is impossible, while the mind is blinded by external, artificial glitter. These riddles served as a filter. A fool saw in them only the eccentricities of an old man, while a wise man saw a map leading to the salvation of the spirit. One of the deepest and most poetic prohibitions was against stirring fire with a knife. For the Pythagoreans, this meant that one must not wound an angry person with a sharp word or add fuel to the flames of another's rage. They believed that anger is an elemental force that can only be tamed by silence, not by a counterstrike. Even in everyday trifles, such as putting on the right sandal first or avoiding well-trodden paths, a philosophy of mindfulness was concealed. To walk the main roads meant to follow the crowd without having one's own opinion, while narrow paths symbolized the individual search for truth. Pythagoras taught his followers that every movement of the body must be a conscious act of will, not a mechanical gesture. Ordinary life was transformed into a continuous meditation, where even how you made your bed after sleep had significance for the purity of your mind. The world for the Brotherhood was a giant text written in divine signs, and he who knew how to read them gained power over his own destiny. Symbols were not merely a cipher for hiding secrets from the crowd, they were an instrument for the transformation of the person himself. By solving the master's riddle, the disciple changed the structure of his thinking, moving from a literal perception of things to an understanding of the hidden connections between them. Number was the code, music was the rhythm, and the symbol was the image connecting earth and sky. In the silence of the school, pondering the meaning of yet another prohibition, the Pythagoreans realized that behind the visible chaos of events lay a flawless and logical plan. A life lived according to these rules became a work of art, in which there were no random strokes. Pythagoras left us this labyrinth of signs so that we might remember truth is always right before our eyes, but only he who has learned to look through the veil of the ordinary can see it. In an era when the voice of a woman in Greece barely reached beyond the walls of the Gyneceum, Pythagoras opened the doors of his school to daughters and wives, recognizing their intellect as equal to that of men before the face of eternal geometry. This was an unheard-of challenge to the foundations of the ancient world, where a woman was assigned the role of a silent shadow in the depths of the home. Yet in Croton, the white robes of the Pythagoreans were worn by both men and women, sharing a common meal, common studies, and a common silence. The master understood what others would only realize millennia later. If the soul is immortal and in its wanderings changes bodies, then the male or female form is merely a temporary mask, having no power over the purity of human intellect. The Brotherhood became the first fellowship in history where wisdom had no gender, and the sole criterion of worth was the mind's ability to contemplate the flawless beauty of the Tetractys. The symbol of this new era was Theano, the wife of Pythagoras, whose name deservedly stood alongside the greatest thinkers of the school. She was not merely the master's companion, but his closest collaborator, leading the Brotherhood after his passing. To Theano belonged profound works on mathematics and philosophy, in which she explained that numbers do not merely describe the world, but are its living foundation. Her daughters, Demo, Mia, and Arignote, continued this great work, becoming keepers of the secret scrolls and mentors to hundreds of disciples. Demo displayed unyielding loyalty, refusing to sell her father's writings for a great sum, even in years of harsh poverty, declaring that poverty in truth is more honorable than wealth in ignorance. These women proved to the entire world that feminine intuition combined with mathematical rigor gives birth to that very fullness of knowledge to which the fellowship aspired. The Pythagorean household, governed by these women, became an earthly reflection of the cosmic order. They taught that the creation of harmony in daily life, in the raising of children, in the management of the home, in quiet conversation, demands no less discipline of mind than the calculation of planetary motion. The woman philosopher in Pythagoras' vision was not an abstract theorist, but a living embodiment of justice and measure. This luminous image pierced through the centuries, reminding us that civilization reaches its flowering only when male will and female wisdom merge in flawless consonance. In the silence of the halls of Croton, where women and men together bent over diagrams, a hope was born for a world in which the mind is free from all shackles, and the only force governing destiny remains the eternal and beautiful love of truth. Rome believed that its greatest lawgiver, Numa Pompilius, was a secret disciple of the master, having received the keys to governing a people from the hands of the great Samian himself. This legend, passed from mouth to mouth over the centuries, connected the harsh cradle on the banks of the Tiber with the refined wisdom of Magna Graecia. The Romans, building their state on the foundation of duty and iron order, saw in Pythagoras a kindred spirit, an architect who understood that no building and no law would stand unless based upon an unshakable numerical proportion. The belief that the second king of Rome had studied in Croton was for the eternal city not merely a historical tradition, but an act of spiritual self-definition. Through this connection, Rome declared itself the heir of a higher harmony, asserting that its power flowed not from the blind force of the sword, but from a sacred right, consonant with the very rhythms of the cosmos. The influence of the Pythagorean spirit permeated the early Roman rituals and the very structure of society. The idea of a sacred order, where every citizen occupies his place like a note in a chord, became the ethical backbone of the young republic. Harsh discipline, moderation in daily life, and reverence for ancestors, these traits of the Roman character resonated in a remarkable way with the rule of the Pythagorean Brotherhood. Even in moments of the greatest crises, the Romans turned to the image of the master, when an oracle commanded them to erect a statue to the wisest of the Greeks. It was an image of Pythagoras that they raised in the Forum. For the stern patricians and warriors, he was not an abstract dreamer, but a lawgiver of universal scale, whose formulas helped to contain the chaos of human passions within the boundaries of the common good. Although strict historians later argued about dates, asserting that Numa and Pythagoras lived in different eras, for Rome itself this mystical continuity remained an indisputable truth. The spirit of the master was invisibly present at the laying of the stones of the Capitoline, transforming the energy of shepherd tribes into the creative power of an empire. Pythagoras gave Rome a dream of justice as a mathematical constant, unchanging by the whim of kings or the anger of the mob. Behind the dry lines of Roman law and the symmetry of triumphal arches, one could always hear the distant echo of the lyre of Croton. The eternal city became a grand monument to Pythagorean thought, proving that empires crumble, but the numbers and ideals upon which they are built remain eternal landmarks in the ocean of time. Thus the wisdom of the Samian sage found new flesh in stone and law, continuing its endless march through the centuries. The tragedy in the house of Milo became a dark milestone, a moment when the harmony of number collided with the chaos of human hatred, forever changing the trajectory of our path to Plato. The ruin of the Croton school was not merely a random uprising, it was a collision of two tectonic plates of existence. While the Pythagoreans in silence saved their scrolls from the fire, at the other edge of the world, in smoky Ephesus, the flame of a different intellect was already kindling. There Heraclitus, about whom we also tell on the Plateau of Plato, was already forging his philosophy of logos in the fire of change. Imagine this contrast. Pythagoras sought salvation in unchanging structures, in eternal numbers that stand motionless while empires crumble. Heraclitus, however, looking at the same tongues of flame, saw in them the only truth. For him there was no rest, no frozen symmetry. "Everything flows," he whispered, and this whisper reached the burning walls of Croton. Here, at this point in history, the greatest debate of humanity is born, between the eternal statics of number and the fierce dynamics of the flow. Heraclitus caustically remarked that much learning does not teach understanding, aiming directly at the heart of Pythagorean teaching. He contrasted the orderly intervals of the lyre with his own principle of the strife of opposites. But feel the depth of this paradox. It is precisely in this collision of two titans that the roots of our idealism are born. Pythagoras gave us the skeleton of the universe, its flawless blueprints. Heraclitus, on the other hand, breathed life into this skeleton, filling it with the heat of eternal motion. Without the Pythagorean limit, we would forever drown in the chaos of a bottomless river, and without the Heraclitean fire, we would turn into cold statues in a world of dry mathematics. The scattering of the surviving Pythagoreans along the shores of the Mediterranean was not an end, but a great sowing. Their ideas about the immortal soul and strict order were now to meet with the war of opposites of the Ephesian, so that later, in the gardens of the Academy, Plato could unite them into a single whole. Gazing at the ashes of their school, the exiles carried within themselves the knowledge that number remains true even when the flame licks the paint from the columns. The defeat in Croton became a strategic victory of the spirit. The teaching went deep into the very DNA of civilization. There in sacred silence it met the fiery logos of Heraclitus. In this eternal tension between everything stands and everything flows, the heart of Western thought began to beat, determining the path of each of us who, today, before sleep, seeks order in this strange, ever-changing, yet wonderfully ordered world. Pythagoras dissolved into the mists of Metapontum, yet his echo continues to resonate in every formula, in every chord, and in the very architecture of our sleep, transforming the chaos of the everyday into the divine symphony of number. We often imagine that ancient worlds lie in ruins, buried beneath the sands of time, but look closer at the fabric of our reality. Every time you open a book, every time you hear a pure note or gaze upon the symmetry of a cathedral, you are touching the mind of a man who first dared to say, "All is number." We still inhabit a world that this great Samian envisioned. We fall asleep in cities built according to the laws of geometry, and we awaken to the sound of digital signals that are in essence the same ones and twos, the monad and the dyad, flowing from the sacred Tetractys. Pythagoras did not merely discover theorems, he discovered the very possibility of order. He taught us that behind the visible disorder of life, behind its pain, its anxieties, and its haste, there dwells an eternal and unchanging beauty of proportion. The end of the master's life marked the beginning of his endless presence in the very DNA of our civilization. This presence is invisible, like the music of the spheres, which we fail to hear only because it has always been sounding. But tonight, as the world around you grows quiet and the shadows lengthen, you may begin to sense its rhythm. Your breath, the beating of your heart, the slow drift of thoughts before sleep, all of these obey the great law of harmony. You are not merely a grain of sand in the void, you are part of a vast equation, one that forever tends toward perfection. In this journey through Croton and Samos, through the fire of persecution and the silence of temples, we have sought not facts, but a state of being. that very state of the plateau where the mind attains clarity and the soul finds rest. Pythagoras prepared the ground for us. He built the foundation upon which the great Plato would later raise his world of ideas. We have planted the root, the first element of our idealism, the belief that truth is beautiful and that number is divine. Close your eyes now and let this echo carry you away. Allow the turmoil of the day to dissolve into the flawless geometry of the starry sky. Remember that you are safe, held within a cosmos that is ordered and full of meaning. The silence that surrounds you now is not an emptiness. It is that very pause between the measures of the great symphony. The same symphony that Pythagoras listened to on the seashore thousands of years ago. And this music, it never ceases.